The Comanche Empire, America's forgotten superpower. The Comanche weren't just warriors, they were empire builders, raiders who turned the horse into a weapon so effective that entire nations, Spain, Mexico, even the young United States, bled under their hooves. But their rise wasn't just about glory or skill, it was about brutality, about captives, about a society that survived and expanded by pulling outsiders into its bloodline, willingly or not. The Comanche were the most feared light cavalry on earth, horseback archers who could shoot 6 arrows before a soldier could fire once, raiders who could cover 100 miles in a day and be gone before you could light a signal fire. But their power came at a cost. Settlers called them Lords of the Plains. Others called them butchers. And both were right. For nearly 2 centuries, the Comanche dominated the American Southwest and completely drenched it in blood. This is the truth of the Comancheria. Unfiltered, the Comanche weren't always the lords of the plains. In the 1700s, empires like Spain and France claimed the Southwest with ink on a map. But on the ground, the Comanche wrote their claim with fire and steel. They weren't born horsemen, they became horsemen. When Spanish Mustangs exploded onto the plains, the Comanche didn't just adopt them, they became them. Within a generation, they reinvented themselves as mounted predators. By the 1740s, they were the apex power in the Southwest. Spanish colonists abandoned entire outposts rather than face them. Within a generation, they controlled the southern plains completely, driving out the Apaches, dominating the Utes, and raiding as far south as Mexico. And indeed they did, because the Comanche's empire stretched from Colorado to Mexico. The result was Comancheria, a territory the size of a European kingdom, controlled not by cities or walls, but by fear. Tactics and strategies. Comanche warfare was terror in motion. Warriors could hang under a horse's neck, firing arrows while using the animal as a shield. They hit isolated cabins, wagon trains, and villages without warning. And they didn't fight wars, they fought annihilations. The strategy wasn't conquest, it was dominance through fear. They struck ranches and villages at dawn. They stole horses by the thousands. They kidnapped women and children. If they actually left survivors, it was only to spread stories of what happened. To fight them was to fight phantoms who knew every canyon, every stream, every escape route. Settlers and Mexicans lived in dread. A Comanche raid wasn't just theft, it was psychological warfare. Technology and weapons. The Comanche bow, short, sinew-backed, powerful enough to drive an arrow through a buffalo at 40 yards. And at full gallop, a Comanche could fire 6 arrows before a soldier reloaded his musket. Lances, war clubs, and even eventually stolen or traded rifles from white and Mexican sources were also part of their arsenal. But the horse was the real weapon. The Comanche bred herds in the tens of thousands. Every boy rode before he walked. Every warrior was a cavalryman by birthright. It gave them unmatched mobility, the ability to vanish into the horizon long before militias could respond. The key figures we'll focus on next are important in early American history. Quanah Parker, the last great chief, half Comanche, half white, son of Cynthia Ann Parker. He fought like a raider, then lived like a diplomat, bridging the 2 doomed worlds. He was proof that captives were not just taken, but some were woven into the tribe's future. Cynthia Ann Parker, his mother, kidnapped at 9, assimilated, married a Comanche chief, bore multiple children. When she was rescued decades later, she refused to return to quote-unquote white life and even wept for the Comanche life she lost. Colonel Ranald Mackenzie, the U.S. cavalry officer who finally broke the Comanches. His brutal campaigns burned villages, destroyed horse herds, and starved the Comanche into submission. John Coffey, Jack as he was called, Hayes, legendary Ranger captain who pioneered mounted shock tactics with Colt revolvers in the 1840s, giving Texans a repeat fire edge in close combat that neutralized the Comanche bow and arrow supremacy. The Texas Rangers, frontier fighters who adopted Comanche tactics, fast raids, surprise ambushes, merciless violence. They used Colt revolvers and repeating rifles to level the battlefield. For settlers, they were defenders. For Comanche bands, they were predators every bit as brutal, a mirror of their own methods. Allied native scouts, tribes like the Tonkawa, Anadarko, and the Apache, to name a few, traditional Comanche enemies who fought the Comanche on their own for years, would also team up and scout for Texans and the U.S. Army, giving local intel and tracking that were finally able to undercut the famous Comanche invisibility. Without them, settlers and the U.S. Army would have been incapable of tracking the Comanche on their own. The Comanche warriors, young men hardened in violence. Some were legends of horsemanship who could ride 200 miles in a week. Others were nightmares for settlers, remembered only for cruelty. And another just as important factor were the railroads and cattle trails. ATSF, Kansas Pacific, Goodnight Loving Trail. Steel rails and cattle corridors brought troops, hunters, settlers, and supply straight into the heart of the plains, shrinking Comanche maneuver space to a map of choke points. Unlike other tribes, the Comanche didn't guard their bloodlines. The reason: Comanche women were often infertile due to the rigorous horseback riding, so the Comanches would absorb captives, Mexican, Spanish, white, even rival native children. Sometimes those captives were adopted fully, sometimes they became slaves, sometimes they were broken so completely that they had no identity left. The result: Comanche bands weren't racially pure like the Apaches or Utes often claimed. They became a brutal melting pot where outsiders were forced into becoming Comanche, whether they wanted to or not. It gave them numbers and it gave them strength, but it also made them feared even among other tribes. Human stories of horror. Comanche raids were infamous for brutality. Settlers knew that capture often meant torture. Men were killed slowly, women were raped, enslaved, or traded. Children were beaten, sometimes adopted, sometimes killed. Mexican villages were raided so often that entire northern provinces collapsed. Thousands of captives, especially children, became commodities in Comanche society. But the Comanche also lived under constant threat. When the buffalo herds began to vanish, starvation loomed, and when U.S. cavalry campaigns destroyed horse herds and villages, the Comanche faced the same helplessness they once inflicted on others. No one came out clean. There's more than a few indelible stories of human suffering on the plains during this time, but these are so brutal and should never be forgotten. Rachel Plummer, 1836. Kidnapped at 17 during the Fort Parker raid, she wrote about the torture she and her family endured. Beatings, constant abuse, forced to watch her own infant murdered before her own eyes. Her account shattered the romantic image of Indians forever for Texas settlers. The Parker family. In 1836, the Comanche raided Fort Parker. They killed adult men, took women and children, including Cynthia Ann Parker. The story became a frontier legend, half cautionary tale, half rallying cry for vengeance. Matilda Lockhart, 1840. Captured at 13, she was tortured so brutally that when she was ransomed back, her body was covered in burns, her nose burned away, her face mutilated. Her testimony hardened Texan resolve for war. Bianca Bank Babb, 1866. Captured as a child in Texas, she lived years among the Comanche. Her adopted Comanche mother, Tequashana, treated her with kindness, protecting her within the band. In her memoir, Bank remembered Tequashana not as a monster, but as a surrogate mother. Her story is proof that captivity wasn't always brutality. Sometimes it became family. These weren't isolated incidents. Torture was part of the Comanche toolkit. Captives were beaten, burned, raped, mutilated. Children were sometimes killed in front of their parents. Others were adopted, raised as Comanche, and became warriors themselves. And these stories taken together show the full spectrum of Comanche life in captivity. Some endured torture that broke their bodies and spirits. Others were absorbed so deeply they never wanted to return to their previous lives. This was obviously a complicated time in history to try and retroactively judge morality. But for settlers during this time, the Comanche were not just enemies. They were nightmares in human form. The brutal honesty of it all. The Comanche weren't noble warriors living in harmony with nature. They were conquerors, raiders, slave takers, torturers. They built their empire on fear and violence, as ruthless as any European power. Entire Mexican provinces lived in terror of them. Apaches were driven nearly to extinction by them. Settler families in Texas learned that a single war party could wipe out generations in an afternoon. But here's the other side. The US answer was scorched earth. Buffalo, the Comanche's lifeblood, were exterminated by white hunters, most times with government encouragement. Campaigns under Mackenzie and Sheridan targeted not just warriors, but women, children, and the horses that defined the Comanche's world. One side mutilated captives with fire. The other starved tribes into surrender by slaughtering animals from trains for sport. The frontier wasn't good versus evil. It was brutality meeting brutality. There were no quote-unquote good guys on the frontier, only different kinds of horror. And in the end, industrial firepower crushed horseback ferocity. What if, through the lens of modern retrospect on War Unfiltered, what if the Comanche had modernized faster, adopted rifles widely, formed alliances with other tribes instead of preying on them, built permanent settlements? Could they have carved out a lasting nation-state? Maybe, but the record shows they rarely cooperated beyond their own bands. Their economy was built on the amount of horses they could acquire, captives they could ransom, and plundered goods for trade. They would bleed rivals instead of uniting them. They thrived on raiding, not building. That made them exceptionally terrifying, but also fragile. And what if the US had chosen coexistence instead of extermination? Unlikely. The Comanche didn't want coexistence either. They wanted dominance of the plains. They annihilated other tribes in their territories. They almost single-handedly fought off the Spanish Empire's northern expansion in the 1700s, then fought Mexicans and English settlers alike until the 1870s, all to preserve their way of life and their vast buffalo hunting grounds. They had no intention of becoming neighbors to farmers. The real what-if is darker, though. If the US hadn't pushed west with rifles, railroads, and buffalo hunters, the Comanche might have ruled the southern plains another century. It wouldn't have been peaceful. It would have been a horse empire where terror was the currency. The legacy and memory of the Comanche Empire. The Comanche halted Spain's northward advance. They shattered Mexico's northern frontier. They forced Texas to become a militarized state. They reshaped mounted warfare worldwide. European observers admitted no cavalry could match them, but the cost was catastrophic. Their empire ended not in battle, but in starvation. By the 1870s, buffalo herds were gone, horse herds destroyed, villages burned. Quannaparker tried to lead his people into survival on reservations as an emissary in Washington, D.C., but the world of riders and raids was already gone. Today, the Comanche Nation survives, specifically Comanche County in Oklahoma, and there's also a Comanche Department of Higher Education, where they award scholarships and financial aid, and various other ownerships of tribal smoke shops, and even 6 casinos in Oklahoma. Their economic development still thrives in the Southwest, but the memory of Comancheria lingers, not as myth, but as proof of how violence can both build and destroy empires. Culture and perspective. S.C. Gwynne's book, Empire of the Summer Moon, ripped the romantic mask off the frontier. It didn't paint the Comanche as noble warriors or helpless victims. It painted them as they were, the most terrifying cavalry the world had ever seen, and some of the most brutal. For researchers, Gwynne's work was a turning point. It forced academics and the public alike to admit that the West wasn't John Wayne. It was torture, enslavement, massacres, starvation, and annihilation on both sides. And here's what hits hardest. This isn't ancient history. The Comanche were still raiding even after the American Civil War. Quanah Parker, the last chief, died in 1911. That's the same year Ronald Reagan was born. Think about that. Within 3 generations, America went from cavalry burning Comanche villages to cars driving down paved highways. There are people alive today whose great or great-great-grandparents remember reservation life, buffalo bones piled by rail lines, and ranger patrols. We act like the frontier is prehistoric. It's not. It's yesterday. And that closeness means we're still living in its shadow. The empire of the summer moon may be gone, but its echoes are still in living memory. Thanks for joining us on War Unfiltered. Please like and subscribe for new videos weekly, and comment the next piece of history we should cover. Take care.